All right, we're all set. Thank you guys for coming this afternoon to what I call the Libertarian Hippie Camp, Day 2. I am Stephen Howard. I am president of Vermonters for Liberty. Vermonters for Liberty was an organization started about 5 years ago of liberty activists in Vermont. We came together under the Ron Paul campaign, and we've stuck together ever since. I'm going to be doing a quick introduction of the panel here, then I'll have them talk about themselves for a minute. But before we get started, I wanted to talk briefly about why we're doing this panel. I've attended Liberty Forums and PorcFest year after year, and people are usually surprised to hear that I'm from Vermont. And their first reaction, of course, is, oh my God, I can't believe you're living in that socialist paradise. How can you stand it? And I'm actually quite happy to explain that we activists in Vermont are actually making quite a bit of headway and reaching out to rather unusual audiences that you don't normally associate with the libertarian movement. Normally, whenever you're in a gathering such as this, you have some pretty hardcore libertarians who, know how to talk to themselves, but rarely seem to be able to talk to other political persuasions, conservatives, progressives, liberals, and so forth. And yet, that's exactly the field that we're working in, trying to reach out, not just to within the libertarian community, but outside of our community, and begin that road that we've all experienced ourselves. Because none of us were born libertarians unless somebody wants to change their biography. Anyone here born libertarian? Okay. All right. So without further ado, the idea of this panel is to just talk about the things that we've been able to do and techniques that we've found have been very effective in communicating with people who are not our traditional libertarian audience. So to begin with, we have here our token conservative, Paul Dame. Paul is from the northwestern part of the state. Actually, it's the independent Republic of Chittenden County. Yeah. Basically, there are two parts to Vermont. There's Vermont, and then there's everybody else, or in this case, it's Chittenden County, and they have a special lifestyle, and then everybody outside of Chittenden County, that's Burlington, Vermont, for you who are uninitiated. We live an entirely different lifestyle. So we have Paul here, and then we have Galen Brown, who is our mole within the Second Vermont Republic movement, looking to secede from the Union. And it's been quite an experience working with Galen. And of course, at the end, we have our resident shit stirrer, Jessica Bernier. If you want to cause problems, this is the person you call. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of you to just briefly give a short biography and then answer this question. Before you got involved in the liberty movement, where were you politically? And what started you on the road toward the liberty movement? So we'll start with Paul.
Yeah, so where was I before the liberty movement? I think it's interesting for me to be sitting here on this panel and thinking that 18 months ago, I never would have imagined that I was here. As Stephen described me as conservative, and I think that's an appropriate fit, especially where I was before. Wasn't too involved, but I knew that I liked Ron Paul. And so I was one of the few people that voted for Ron Paul in 2008, but didn't think that there was really anything going on in Vermont. I thought I was the only person, especially living in Burlington at the time. And so I just kind of had these beliefs and principles. You kind of just sort of mind your own business. I grew up in a more rural part of Vermont, so I think that's kind of where that comes from. And it wasn't until the last election in 2012, and I still don't remember how I got connected, but somehow I got a flyer about a rally we were having at the State House in March or April. And that's where I got connected to Vermonters for Liberty and Vermonters for Ron Paul. And really it all started with the sign wave. Somebody said, hey, we're going to go to the street corner and wave signs. And I was like, you know what, I can do that. I don't know about all this other stuff that these people are doing, but I can do that. And I went and I met a couple of people that shared all the same beliefs and principles that I believed and thought I was the only one. And so we continued doing sine waves and other things were going on. People were putting in place, and so I would just show up, and that was really kind of most of the stories. I showed up, and after the primary, it was like, okay, well, now what do we do? And there was this whole talk about delegate stuff. So I was online and reading about that. So I was one of the people who kind of went as the mole in the Republican Party, if you can think about it that way, and went through that delegate process. And actually, again, just by showing up, basically became one of the 14 delegates that Vermont sent to the RNC. And after that, I ended up running for a state house in my town of Essex Junction. All things that if you had told me 6 months before, I never would have been involved, or that I would have been involved, I never would have believed you. But just by staying, getting encouragement by people, the Vermonters for Liberty group, the Facebook group, and realizing that a lot of what we're trying to do is just showing up and being who you are. So that's kind of how I got here today.
How about you, Galen? What's your story?
Turn it on. Oh, wait. Hello. Yeah, so I grew up in rural, middle of nowhere Vermont, kind of surrounded by hippies and rednecks, and never really knew which category I fit in, so I sort of bridged that gap most of my life. The last 10 or so years, I probably would have described myself as a liberal. I was focused on environmental issues. I was an activist for liberty issues as well, but most of my social and professional sphere was in the liberal world. And that was kind of back when I thought liberal meant free thinking and focused on things like liberty and justice instead of statism and collectivism, which really does dominate most of Vermont's political landscape. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've been pretty active in the Second Vermont Republic movement to try to get some momentum to get the state of Vermont to consider secession. And the interesting thing about that experience, I think I hit the statist wall in that world as well. It was mostly dominated by well-meaning, educated, elitist liberals who wanted to defeat the sort of right-wing agenda they saw coming out of DC. It really got sparked by George Bush and all of that. Once Obama got in, the whole movement kind of fizzled out, and the remnants of that were people like us, people who saw liberty and justice and sustainability as values that need to go together, seeing that corporate power dominating state power through statism and collectivism is the problem, not business itself. But I think at this point, the politics of Vermont are still pretty stuck in the rut of statist, collectivist mentality where everyone tries to see solutions as there ought to be a law for that. And we're, I think, maybe representing 15% of the population of Vermont, by my guess, of people who get it and are actually active in voting and doing things. It's not enough to change the political landscape, but it's enough to block things. It's enough to block the gun control efforts. It was enough to block the mandatory vaccination agendas. So I see hope, but I really see more hope in terms of how New Hampshire and Vermont could work together. We're kind of like yin and yang on the map. I think it would actually be a beautiful thing from a bioregional government point of view, maybe after the Mad Max scenario and the shit hits the fan, that this region could get together and form a confederacy of towns and have the town be the governing unit and not anything else. So I'm optimistic because as the shit hits the fan, we'll get more close to those possibilities. And between now and then, it's a game of survival and finding people we can trust and work with.
Okay, Jessica.
Okay. Hi. So I'm Jessica Bernier, and Steve told you I'm a shit stirrer, and I'm proud to say that I am. I have always, I think, questioned authority since I was a little kid, and I was encouraged to do so, and so I just keep doing it. So I always considered myself an independent. I grew up in Connecticut, and I moved to Vermont 17 years ago. So I was very proud when I first started voting to put on my card that I was an independent. And so I never really ascribed to being a Democrat or being a Republican. I think I was intrigued by libertarianism when I was younger, but I just didn't really get into it because I'm like, well, I'm going to join a group. So I grew up in suburban Connecticut, and then I just was like, this is not for me, and I tried multiple times to get out of that scene, and ended up running away to Vermont and meeting my husband in Plainfield, which is hippie central. Goddard College is there. It's like, free, everything, everybody's just a free spirit, and you do what you want, and you make your own curriculum at this college, so, everybody that goes there is sort of live and let live. And I really fell in love with this whole idea of Vermont. To me, I had this idealized version of Vermont where everybody just sort of did their own thing and accepted people for who they were, and you just, you're sort of respect the ground that you walk on, and, accept each other. So that's sort of like this idealized version. And so my biggest thing was like, I need to get a piece of land, and I'm going to grow my own food, and I'm going to have animals, and I'm going to have babies, and we're going to just, we're just going to live here, and we're going to be like, the modern day Scott and Helen, and it's going to be all really cool, and, and then I had kids, and then, you get like, wow, okay, what's going on here? But, you get busy with that stuff, so yeah, paying attention, realizing like, okay, I think it was the election of 2000, and I was like, boy, I don't like all this war that's going on with the Democrats, and so I don't really trust Al Gore, because he's just another one of those guys. But this Bush guy, I don't know about these Republicans, I don't know, so of course, who'd I vote for? Ralph Nader, because he was the guy that was paying attention to home, right? So, but I didn't really give it a whole lot of thought, and then, years go by, one thing comes to another, and my grandmother puts The Creature from Jekyll Island in my hands and says, you got to read this book. And I'm reading this book, and I'm like, whoa, all these pieces start coming together, right? And then at the same time, somebody else gave me Naomi Wolf's End of America, and then I was like, whoa, oh no, holy cow, what's going on here? All right, so this is not okay. And I'm like having nightmares, and and then I turn over Creature from Jekyll Island, and I see this guy, Ron Paul, in the back, and I'm like, Ron Paul, where'd I see that? I just saw his name on a sign that somebody stenciled in New Hampshire. So I get on the internet and I Google it, and I was like, oh my, this guy's saying everything that I want to hear somebody say, So then I'm like, okay, then I'm going nuts, and I'm like, okay, is Ron Paul stuff going on in Vermont? Who are these people, So I find the meetup, and then I'm looking at, and I'm like, this isn't good enough for me. I need to find the people that are really supposed to. I'm looking at FEC reports, and I'm calling people. I'm like hey, you like Ron Paul, Wow, okay, what's going on? We got to do this, and I start calling like the campaign, and they're like, oh, Vermont? Pfft. We got nothing for you. And I'm like, what? Okay, So then it was just sort of like motivated me, like, okay, nobody's going to do this for us. We need to do this. So my first drive was to get on the meetup and say, guys, we got to put ads in the newspaper. Like, we need money. Like, let's get some money together and put some ads in the newspaper. And I was calling radio stations every day, calling the talk shows, the conservative talk shows. And I was like, okay, well, these guys are going to listen to me because they're Republicans. Long story short, I get sucked into the Republican, vortex, and the next thing you know, I'm organizing the biggest Tea Party in the state because I didn't want it to get co-opted by these like freakish Republicans that I was dealing with at the time. So, and then I realized like, whoa, there's like this whole, all these liberal people that I thought were so accepting are calling me a teabagger? Like, what is that? And so it really sort of like, here I am trying to make this nonpartisan thing, and I'm getting pigeonholed because of my affiliations, and I was like, this is like so not cool. But then I just sort of like shrugged that off, and mostly I'm interested in food and health issues and freedom, and the freedom to do what needs to be done for yourself. And, if the state's going to step in and say, your child needs to have all these vaccinations, and we don't really care what, you just need to do it because we say that, you're putting our other kids at risk, or, just any kind of regulations as to what you can grow for food and how you need to, the things you need to do. That's pretty much where my heart is, I think, in making sure that people can be free. Because you can't feed yourself And if you have no control, if your skin is not the border that separates you from anybody else, then you're not a free person. And I completely reject this idea that I'm not a free person. So that's why I'm sitting here.
Can I say something? Jessica was in New Hampshire, out in the snow with us when we were signing for Ron Paul and going around to houses and knocking on doors. She was here in New Hampshire helping us with the Ron Paul campaign.
Okay, just really briefly, my evolution. I started off as a socialist. I actually, when I graduated high school, I was a socialist, strong on socialist issues. And there were 3 steps in the process. Step number 1, I got a book called Ain't Nobody's Business If I Do. And it was like, oh, this is cool. I love this. Because it all made sense to me. But when I talked to my other socialist friends, they all just kind of turned up their nose. Oh my God, that's just a bunch of shit. Oh, all right. And then I made a mistake. I ended up picking up Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. And I read that. And I remember having conversations with my wife every night as we're getting ready to go to bed. And I'm like, oh, this is really cool. And she's like, well, I don't know about that. Well, and of course, nobody wanted to talk about Ayn Rand. And then, of course, the third issue, well, Ron Paul, of course. It always starts with Ron Paul, doesn't it, for us people? Anyway, so I got involved. So in the 2007-2008 campaign, Jessica, myself, and a lot of different activists got together, and we started really putting the spurs to the campaign in Vermont. We were really disappointed with the return, but we were just learning as we were doing. So come 2012, we did it again, and this time we really took it seriously. And seriously, we scared the crap out of the Vermont Republican Party. I kid you not. The chairman of the Vermont Republican Party, the day after the election, actually got on television and claimed that somehow we had perverted the process because Ron Paul had taken second place and had denied Romney his 50% of the vote, that somehow, that was the wrong result. But as far as activism is concerned, primarily, as you might well have guessed, I spend most of my time doing education and outreach. Citizen activism is really what I'm involved in. I've found that a lot of people feel very disempowered by the process, and it's a question of educating citizens and giving them the tools in order to engage and involve in the process. So as an example, in 2008, I did a tour of the state, 6 venues, where literally I did a citizens workshop. And I talked about the really nuts and bolts of citizen activism and politics and how to engage your legislators. And then in 2010, I did the We Can't Afford It tour, where I took an economist to 14 locations around Vermont where we specifically talked about the coming economic crisis. Actually, it was 2009 because we had just turned the corner. And it literally, it was an eye-opening experience because so many people had no idea how bad the fiscal house was in Vermont and the United States. And, we continue to do outreach efforts. But anyway, that's my story. That's how I got involved in the process, and we are actually burning up time here, so I'm going to jump right to it. So to go back, what type of tips or what things do you keep in mind when you're dealing with people who are non-traditional libertarian, non-traditional audiences when you broach liberty-related subjects? So it looks like Jessica grabbed the mic first. Go ahead.
Well, I kind of started out with this very bullheaded, here I am attending I call it the Ron Paul Forum's University, right? So I got totally steeped in all things libertarian, and I was like, this is right, it's just right, and and I'm arguing with conservatives, and and then I realized, I'm butting my head so much that maybe the trick here is to be a little gentler and to try to build a bridge. So over the years, I've kind of evolved into trying to find the common ground, and then going from there, and also trying to find the things that people, 5 years ago we agreed on. If we agreed on it 5 years ago, what's changed? Is it my position that's changed, or is it your position that's changed? And let's get to a rational way of thinking about it and discussing it, instead of I can't believe, well, some people you can have that like kind of, conversation with, but other people you have to sort of be just a little bit more gentler and look for that, that place of non-confrontational confrontation.
I think you start just by asking questions. We make a lot of assumptions, especially as we talk politically, because I think we usually want to believe that everyone believes the same thing that we do. And so I think an important part is just starting by asking, well, what do you think about this? And you can get a lot of information from that person. And I think you can get to what Jessica is talking about, is find those areas where you agree and establish a really good foundation on that. And then eventually, over time, I think you have the opportunity to win them over to your side. So, for example, as a conservative, I'm like, oh, Ron Paul is great on all these different things, and I don't know about this drug thing. I can remember hearing, CNN's like, oh, when we come back, it's, Ron Paul versus one of the Baldwin brothers on legalization. And I was like, I don't know about this Baldwin guy, but Ron Paul's a conservative, so I'm sure he's going to be, being against legalization of drugs. And I came back, and he wasn't. But he laid out a great argument. And because I had found all the things I agreed with him before, it made me listen to him. And I think that's one of the things we got to be careful of. And I find a lot as a conservative coming into the libertarian movement is a lot of times you've got to hold all these positions to start with. And if you're not 100% libertarian, then there's the door. And I think you really got to start with where you agree and enjoy those agreements, and then just work on them. Because if somebody has some of those things that they share, they're a rational, thoughtful person. And I think, a lot of the positions, all the positions we have are right, and it's just a matter of making the information available. So start by asking questions and start where you agree and move from there.
Yeah, I agree with the find common ground approach. I think had a lot of sort of one-on-one success with people who may have fallen in their mind pretty firmly in the right or left sort of mainstream Democrat Republican clusterfuck. But the common ground issues are things like, do you like crony capitalism? Do you like government corruption? Do you like mega corporations controlling you through their control of our government? Do you think that this stuff is, being solved by the current paradigm, or do we need to try something new? And I really try to keep in mind that as deep in a rut as someone may seem, the vast majority of people do have good intentions. They may be misinformed. They may or may not be open to considering other thoughts. But if you take a, confrontational, I'm going to bust your chops approach, most people dig in and get defensive and don't listen. And I think that's one of the things that's really great about Vermont and New Hampshire is that most people do at least see themselves as independent thinkers. The climate and terrain forces people to do the, live and let live and help a neighbor out just to survive. So, we've got a culture here that is rooted in community values and rooted in not relying on some institution to save us, but taking care of business. After Irene kicked the pants out of Vermont, that response where everybody just came out the next day and excavators and trucks and everybody just got to work. Nobody waited for the government to do a thing, and the government really never did do anything. So, and that was fine. I think that was a great example of the left and right coming together in Vermont and people getting to know each other and realizing that these labels are, in a lot of ways bullshit, but we can, just get real. And there are some common ground issues that are bringing liberals and conservatives together in Vermont. Things like the GMO Monsanto thing, the vaccine choice thing brought a lot of people together. Even corporate personhood, I think, brought a lot of people together as a bridge issue. So, the next one that I think really needs to get emphasis is the monetary foundation, the whole Federal Reserve thing, the Jekyll Island book. There's a million books out there that get into detail about this whole scam. And it's about to burst again, this time through the derivatives casinos, and the derivatives have priority over your savings accounts. The Cyprus scenario is right on our doorstep. We can put that warning out to people, and then when it happens, maybe they'll listen to us for the next set of questions that we need to deal with.
And the only thing I wanted to expand on, and again, the common theme, of course, is common ground. But also realize when you're engaged in a conversation with anyone, there's always an audience. There's always an audience. I'll give you an example. We had a tent at, we had a booth at a county fair in Vermont, and there was a gentleman from New York State who came up. Why is it always New York State, by the way? I'm not sure. But a gentleman from New York State comes up, and he's like, well, you know, I believe in public education. Well, you know, we really believe in choice. And we had a conversation. The conversation between him and I lasted an hour and a half, 2 hours. And I just stood there, and we went point by point. And the guy kept going back, well, you know, you're not really offering an alternative. And I said, no, I am offering an alternative. You're just rejecting it. But we remained polite. I took his points. I raised counterpoints. Went on for 2 hours. The guy finally exhausted himself and he left. That was about the only explanation I could give. 10 minutes later, 2 people from booths nearby us came over to the booth and they complimented not only how we had handled the situation, but they had actually, I never really thought about it that way. I never really looked at it that way. These people were a captive audience, but they were listening in. Another thing we do, we'll do like information booths. So we usually try to get a hook. That is, get people into the booth to listen to what we have to say. Knowing full well that if you get a small crowd together, what happens? The crowd gets bigger. People stop to figure out why are you standing there. And that's the audience you're really shooting for. So I'm actually, if I'm talking to you, I'm really pointing over your shoulder and I'm talking to the gentleman behind you who's listening in, who doesn't know I know he's listening in. And that's how you do the outreach. People, especially in Vermont, aren't big on confrontation. You don't see a lot of confrontational Vermonters. But they're really, you know, they don't like to talk about politics, but they do it all the time at their kitchen table. So when we try to do outreach efforts and whenever we do activist training, one of the things we do talk about is realize whenever you're speaking to anyone, you don't have to convince them of anything, but you are planting a seed of knowledge, and it's usually the person behind them that you're really talking to. So with that, I'd like to actually go from there, and let's talk about some of our successes. Galen's actually pointed out a couple, and Jessica has as well. Jessica, you were involved in the Vax Choice movement, as was Galen. Why don't you talk about that briefly, what the issue is and how was it approached? We'll have Galen do it.
Yeah, the vaccine choice thing has been a sleeper of an issue for a long time. I mean, there have been people active in it.
Galen, could you just expand on what exactly is
Yeah,
vax
so in Vermont, for a long time, and still, you can claim an exemption to the law that requires school students in public school to get vaccinated. You can claim a philosophical objection, which says just, I don't think it's a good idea, or you can claim a religious exemption. Last year, or the year before, they tried to get rid of both of those exemptions so that you could not claim an exemption and you had to get your kids vaccinated or they couldn't go to school. That stirred up about 1,000 people on a petition within a couple weeks. We did a couple of big marches around Burlington and Montpelier, and it really actually mobilized a lot of people to just stop and think about the idea of the government forcing you to inject chemicals into your newborn so they can go to school. On top of the fact that we found out the real information, which was that there was no decline in vaccination rates. The state health department came out with all these bogus, complete lie statements that there's a huge downward trend in vaccination rates, and that's what caused the pertussis outbreak. Turns out that 86% of the people who got whooping cough had been vaccinated. We put that news out and people actually listened. And it also turns out that the vaccine rates are above 96% of kids. So the whole thing was smoke and mirrors just to give Merck and Pfizer and these guys some more money. And they had, 12 full-time pharma lobbyists in the State House every day. We had 2 or 3 people rotating in, 1 person a day, going to committee hearings, making a shitstorm in the committee hearings. We packed those rooms, we made noise, we clapped, we didn't do what they told us when they told us to be quiet. We took video. We embarrassed a lot of these people and we scared them into losing their good guy image by just saying, look, there's a lot of strength in Vermont's alternative medical industry, if you want to call it that. There's a lot of chiropractic and naturopath solutions. A lot of people don't use mainstream medicine. So we were able to, with a pretty, I'd say, attack-oriented posture, come away and get that whole thing derailed completely. which surprised me. I thought the ship had sailed. I thought that we weren't going to succeed. I was ready to, homeschool my kid. I'm going to do that next year anyway. But it did show that, a relatively small number of people, no more than 1,000 people being active, made this whole thing stop. And I think the gun control issue was a similar number of people that put a stop to it.
So one success I'm really proud of is we preserved the ability to purchase raw milk without extra precautions. We had a situation come up. We have in our state, there's a lobbying group, sort of a grassroots lobbying group, but they do these raw milk classes where they take raw milk at a farm and they teach people how to make butter and yogurt and different kinds of soft cheeses and different things like that. And our Agency of Agriculture decided that these were illegal. These classes were not legal, and they interpreted the law in a way where they ordered this group to cease and desist these classes. And so when we heard about it, we're like, what? How can you say that you can't teach people how to make butter? For as long as people have been milking animals, people have been making butter and cheese from this stuff. How can that not be legal? How can you do that? So, we tried to work with this group, and, it's just a bunch of shit stirrers like myself, and we tried to work with this group, and they didn't want to, push back as hard as we felt that they should, so we went ahead and pushed back ourselves. So one thing that I've noticed is that the more creative that you get in your protest, the more attention you get, and the more people you can rally to your cause. So we decided to have something called Butter Appreciation Day. And so we did butter making classes in the State House. So we were doing an act of civil disobedience in our State House. Because of other things that I had organized at the State House security decided that they needed to put other people on because we might have so many people show up that they would not be able to handle our opposition. It was really beautiful. I mean, it was like, okay, everybody bring a jar of milk with you, a jar of cream with you to the State House. This guy right here, he made these bandoleros of baby bottles, it was like really cool. I mean, it was just, we were like way over the top, just silly, and it was like, am I a criminal? Legislators, am I a criminal? I have a jar of milk here. Is it raw? Is it pasteurized? How do you know? How can you tell? I mean, so we actually, we had legislators coming down. The State House security was standing in there, and they were like, oh, so that's how you do it? I mean, how do you make butter? You put cream in a bottle and you shake it. I mean, that's horrible, So we ended up, the state wanted to get a list of everybody who was going to be doing classes, and they want to have the death sign, which basically says you're going to die if you consume this stuff, and our argument was like, wait a minute, you can have a cooking class. I could go to the supermarket, I could buy a pound of ground beef, I could take it out to the parking lot, put it on a little grill on the tailgate of my truck, call it a cooking class, and I don't have to put a sign out that says you could die from eating this when it's undercooked. But that's the truth, right? So what's the difference between raw meat and raw milk? One is clearly prone to have more pathogens, and guess what? That's the meat that you buy in the supermarket. So anyways, we were able to convince enough legislators that were on the Agriculture Committee that this was really ridiculous, that the state was overstepping. It was at the behest of the USDA. And so we were able to just nip this thing in the bud, and we made front page news, and it was all great and wonderful. So raw milk classes were preserved because people said, this is stupid. And they said it in a creative way, and that I'm very proud of that.
Paul, do you want to jump in on any of this? Or? Okay. All right. So looking at my notes here, what have been some of the challenges that you've faced in spreading a liberty message in Vermont? Any type of significant where, oh my God, I can't believe I can't get this, or something on that line of thought. I do want to put in on this one thing to carry on the idea of liberty activism. I actually served for a while on a planning commission in my local town it's strange to have a libertarian on a planning commission. But I served on a planning commission, and throughout the time that I was there for 6 years, my fellow commissioners who, they're Vermonters, the stereotypical Vermonters in the sense that they were very progressive, very environmentally conscious, very statist mindset for the most part. And then, I end up talking to them on a very regular basis about the idea of property ownership and the ability of property owners to take care of their own land and are actually the better conservators of the land. And what I've found over the years, and I left the board just recently, that many of the things that I was talking about and was being poo-pooed when I first started is now the language they're using when they're dealing with the community at large and their own conflicts with the state and with their own local town government. They're using the same arguments that I was using way back when I was just an idiot. I don't know what happened. I don't know how they suddenly got so incredibly smart, but I'm so proud of that. So anyway, having said that, what are some of the challenges that you guys have faced out there spreading the message? Something that may stick out in your mind where you can't believe they never got it. Actually, I want to start with Paul, because Paul, you're on the spot, dude.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I think maybe the thing that surprised me was the whole the gun issue in Vermont, because it's an unwritten rule that as progressive as Vermont can be, you just don't mess with people with their guns, right? I mean, I think the only incumbent that I know of who did not win re-election was Peter Smith, because he voted against the NRA. So I was kind of shocked that whole issue came up, and I was embarrassed because the House seat that I ran for, the person who won re-election was the person who introduced the bill. So there was an example of, although I faced defeat initially in November because I didn't win that seat, I felt like I was in a position to kind of take that loss and help advance this issue, even though it didn't help kind of my what I was initially intending to do. So I had gone around and canvassed the neighborhood, so I had an idea who were the people that supported this issue. So I could go back and say, hey, our representative said that they didn't hear from anyone, or they only heard from 3 people in their home district who opposed the new gun regulation, which was going to basically eliminate Vermont's constitutional carry. And so I went back, and within a day or two, I got a petition of about 20 signatures. And so there was and I'm not sure how, but somebody found out that I was the guy who lost to the person who introduced this bill, and I got invited to speak at a Second Amendment rally. And I kind of opened up with the fact that I'm not happy to be here, because the fact that we're here, and I think part of the fact that we're here at PorcFest too, is because the state is not respecting what we all think is common sense, and the idea of kind of live and let live and allow, just mind your own business. And I think Vermonters get that idea, and the difficulty is applying that concept to a particular situation, because everybody wants to be a libertarian when they're in the minority, but when they like their ideas so much, they think they need to spread them. That's where the conflict happens. And I think reminding people that there are other people out there who are just as intelligent and well-meaning as you, who want you to do something that you're not comfortable with. So I think, in trying to make some of those examples, the example I used in my speech was, about some of the restrictions we have on voting, and how, the second, if we had to background check to get your voter registration, people would be up in arms. But to use your constitutional right, then there's all this question about it. So I think it's been just applying that idea of, mind your own business to specific issues.
So what you're saying is more people have been killed by voting than by guns.
I didn't say that, but now that you said it, I can agree with you.
Absolutely. How about you, Galen?
In 2009, I ran for Vermont State Senate. There's 30 senators in the Vermont Senate, so it's a very small pie. And we had about 10 or 12 people who all ran for Senate, and our goal was to put candidates for all 30 seats. and all be independents, all be sort of militant agnostics around the political party idea itself, and all with some affiliation or some openness to the idea of Vermont seceding. And the interesting thing about this group is that there were socialists, there were libertarians, there were people across the spectrum in those candidate spots. And, you know, Vermont has this idea of independent politicians. You know, Bernie's the big hero, he's an independent, supposedly. You know, most people in Vermont polls, I think it's like 46% say that they're independent. They don't affiliate with one party. So I thought that this is a good strategy. You know, we're gonna hit the independent political sphere here, and we're gonna come at it from the whole spectrum. It's about, you know, shedding the status quo. It's about everything from sustainability and environmental issues to anti-war and financial responsibility. It actually made a lot of sense. And it was an interesting thing for me campaigning. You know, I got really positive response. The debates were really interesting. I think I ended up getting 10 or 12% of the vote for not spending a dollar. I thought that was all right. But the vast majority of people, even though we did get some pretty good publicity as a group, still vote Democrat or Republican in their local races. So my conceived notion before that was that maybe there's the Democrat-Republican thing locking up at the presidential elections or congressional elections, but at the state level, the elections in one county, people are going to vote independent. People aren't so locked into Democrats and Republicans or the status quo or supporting incumbents. I think there's a sad disappointment from what actually happened in 2010 in that context. Although there are some, rays of hope, but I think that there's still a very big dominance, even at the local political level, of people saying, no, I'm going to vote for the guy who can win, so I'm going to make sure I vote for the Democrat because I don't like the Republican. And that whole mentality, in my mind now, I don't see any real electoral politics as anything to put time into. It's maybe a place to defend yourself with, but there's no hope in that, in my opinion. I think that we need to stir up shit in other ways. I think that for me, I can be more impactful as a citizen lobbyist than as a candidate. So, but it was an interesting learning experience, but ultimately pretty disappointing in terms of our political system, even at the local election level.
Okay, for you keeping score, the shit score is Galen Brown, 7, Jessica Bernier, 5. Jessica, it's your turn. Yes, really. I'm impressed, actually. No F-bombs yet. We are so proud of you. Go ahead.
So the question is, what have been the
some of the things
challenge?
that, the challenges, things that
challenges.
really stuck out for you.
I think the biggest challenge is other people making assumptions about you because of your position on X issue or Y issue. And getting people to, sort of realize that, okay, I can be, pragmatically involved with a party, but that doesn't mean that I toe the line. Or I can, not be a part of a party and still be able to agree with those people on certain things. Or getting pigeonholed because of an affiliation, say, with the Tea Party. Like, one of the things that we had really, in Vermont, we have an open primary. So you don't have to be registered as anything to vote for a candidate. And we made an effort to capitalize on that in the Ron Paul, in the last primary, 2012. We said, I'm sure everybody here has seen those Ron Paul super brochures. We made a Vermont brochure. We took Vermont issues and we basically Vermontified Ron Paul. And so that is how we got the 25% of that vote. 26, okay. And that's how
we're proud of that 1%, baby.
And that's how we kept, Romney at bay. But what we had attempted to do, Paul had said, he came to this rally that we had. We had Robin Kerner come out. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with him, Blue Republican. We really wanted to just widen the scope. Ron Paul may be running as a Republican, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't represent you, because he probably does. And here's why we think he might. So we really tried to show how the Tea Party and Occupy have this like it's like a Venn diagram, right? So there's like this overlap, and here the overlap, this is where we are. We're right in the middle. And it was like, you got your Tea Party people on the one side and you got your Occupy people on the other side, and it's like, oh, you're trying to co-opt us by associating us with everybody twinkle, and it's just like, and it was just like so frustrating. Like, I'm pretty emotional. If you can tell, I get kind of fired up, and I'm like, and I'm like in tears because, like, I can't believe these people, they're so closed-minded, and we're supposed to just, how come we can't see this? What's so hard about that? But so that's the biggest challenge to me is getting people to like bust out of their own perceptions of what other people think because they affiliate one way or another, or somewhere out there.
And I think
Them.
that's kind of, Galen said something earlier about one-on-one, and that's why I think that's the most helpful, because you can avoid a lot of that. Well, you sound like one of those occupiers, or you sound like a Tea Party person. It's like, I'm just talking about this issue and this idea and this position, and keeping the focus fairly narrowed, I think, is where you have the most success.
And the one frustration, and I want to get to questions real fast, the one frustration I have is the lack of intellectual honesty demonstrated by both sides of the political aisle, where, you've got Republicans who are talking about individual liberty, but not too much individual liberty, or you have the liberals talking about the needs of the community, but then when you talk about really, getting down to that, the individual, the citizen, and you're talking about true localism, true independence, they suddenly seize up because the idea, oh my God, you're going to take away my mommy government, and I really can't live without my big bad mommy government. And it drives you nuts because you can get them only so far, and then all of a sudden they realize where you're going and they seize up and they run the other way. And it's very frustrating, especially in a discourse, even on a one-on-one level, where you get them to admit that localism is a great idea and true localism is individual action and voluntary action, and then all of a sudden they run for the hills screaming, nothing can happen without the government. And we are making progress. We're making a great deal of progress considering how relatively small we are, and yet we've been pretty effective in changing the discourse. One of the things that we always point out to ourselves as a way of patting ourselves on the back is that the people who 5 years ago were laughing at us are now using the exact same words we were using in their political discourse, whether they be on the left and the right. They're talking our language, and we've made that progress. But I wanted to open up the floor for questions. Oh my God, there's a lot of them. All right, so let's get you a microphone. Thank you. Okay, what I need you to do is stand up, introduce yourself, give us where you live, what's your political background, and then ask, no, I'm joking. What's your question?
We came here, we drove through Vermont on our way here, and there was one 10-mile stretch where we must have driven by 1,000 windmills. And I was just curious, is that industry on the way up, or is it on the way out? What's your position?
All right, and who wants to take this?
And I just want to know, where is the funding? How does the funding work?
I worked in a big solar power company for a couple years. I probably know everybody in the wind industry in Vermont, and it's a mess. There have been a few big installations that have gone through. Vermont has a real ironic situation going on with this, with Act 250 that all the environmental and lefties applaud. It doesn't apply to renewable energy or to wind turbines on ridgelines. So the state has a group of 3 people that get to rubber stamp, and they rubber stamp every single application that comes through. All these wind power projects are owned by Green Mountain Power, which is a division of Gaz Metro out of Canada, which is a division of Gazprom out of Russia. So our whole energy infrastructure in Vermont is owned by foreign megacorps, including all those wind turbines, all to save, climate change or whatever. Meanwhile, the state is not addressing the actual carbon issue, even if you think it is an issue. I personally don't. But our electric grid is already pretty much carbon free. So they're doing all this stuff to supposedly, fight climate change, while they're ignoring all the stuff that actually does have carbon emissions. It's layers and layers of hypocrisy and crony capitalism.
Unfortunately, we only have 4 minutes left.
Okay, so let's go to our next question.
Make this really quick. So I grew up in New York. I live in Philadelphia now, of all places, and I have for 20 years. I have relatives up here in Vermont, and I've noticed that there are so many disaffected New Yorkers and East Coasters in Vermont, and I wonder how much that contributes to this, we'll talk at politics at the dinner table, but we won't discourse about it outside of the dinner table.
My experience, here's the irony of the whole thing. I grew up in Keene, New Hampshire, and then I went to Vermont to find a job, and I can't get back now. I'm stuck in Vermont. But be that as it may, it's actually cultural for New England and Vermont especially. You can have any conversation you want. You can talk about the sex lives of your cattle. That's fine, but you can't talk politics. So it's not necessarily disaffected New Yorkers. It's very tough to get people to open up on the issue of politics. Next question. What? Oh, we have a disagreement here.
But Vermont is a suburb of New York City in a lot of ways. It really.
Next question.
Hi, I recently had a chance to talk to some of our MPPs. I'm from Ontario. I know, don't be very sad for me. So some of our MPPs, and I gave them a presentation, and I was shocked. These are all older, white, rural men. And they told me I was an extremist, I was a teabagger. I mean, they got very emotional, and I was just pointing out to the legislation and the effects of all this legislation in one big group. So how do you deal with this emotional response? I mean, I'm looking, this is at 7:30 in the morning, and they're practically in tears, and they don't even know what to say. They said, I shouldn't have eaten that muffin, one guy said. And he said, what does that have to do with anything? So how do you deal with that emotional, just crazy emotional response? Because I'm sure you've gotten it too.
The answer is that you don't know. Each of us handle it individually. And any one of us here is more than happy to meet with you outside. The next speaker's coming on, and you can ask us additional questions at that time. So thank you guys very much for sitting in and asking the questions. Have a good one.